Welcome in this second part of the RealFlow tutorial of waterflow. In the first part we can see about the simulation and interface RealFlow, and for beginning, for start to move inside this software, and we can see also for simulation with the particle emitter, the standard particle emitter with spline and square emitter. The final result, we can see the simulation. Now we can see how can render it in Krakatoa. I will show you a render with Krakatoa for have a similar effect about this footage. Is the render with free version of particle. I have the particle in voxel mode for create this little fog, and the standard particle with another effect. It's a nice effect. It's without the location, because it's not my goal render with location in this case, because it's only the tutorial for web. So when you have the simulation, you can also create the mesh for render, but now we don't see the mesh, we don't see the render the mesh. See in the last part of this tutorial, because I will show you the render with Krakatoa. Krakatoa is the plugin for 3D Studio Max, and it's you can find, you install the demo, for example, and you can find under the render setting Krakatoa is open this GUI. This GUI it's terrible when you open, because I have more rollout, but it's not very difficult to use for this example. When you create the particle emitter, for example pFlow, classic pFlow, and okay, Krakatoa, and you render, you see is nothing, because it's not particle, but real it's particle. Okay, Krakatoa what render the particle with the dot, and if you, for example, think to apply +6 the shape, okay, I apply the shape, and I think to render this shape or with a different scale, but Krakatoa don't render the shape. So if you can delete, and if you put more, you can see it's render the dot of your particle flow. Every particle it's one dot, so you can render only the dot. Okay, but again I don't see nothing, because for render with Krakatoa I need to apply the one light. For have a light, for create light in immediately, you can click on schematic view, press the right button of your mouse, create default light spotlight. It's okay now from schematic view, and if you render you can see the particle. Okay, now the particle have this color and have this density, and more, but we can see with the our example of from RealFlow. For load, for example, the bin sequence, when you go to file, open project file, you can find in particle you have the file bin. It's your sequence of your simulation for spline and for square. You can load in 3D Studio Max with the import from the particle flow, for example, or from the RealFlow particle load, and you can choose your sequence. Okay, when you load, you can see the ticks, but you can put the dot. Okay, and if you render, you can see it's not very nice, it's not very fine, your particle. Also, in another way for load and for render with Krakatoa, it's use the tools of Krakatoa. You can find under Krakatoa, you can find PRT loader. If you put the PRT loader, you can choose to your sequence, and you can add another sequence, so you can don't have every one for your sequence of loader, but you can use only one for your load for your sequence. So another, you can put 100 here. Okay, yeah, and you, for example, add files, and you can give the square sequence. Okay, now it's complete. Okay, and it's very nice and it's very optimized tools for render with Krakatoa. In fact, if I open the file, my file of, you can see I create an animation of camera. I create one loader for one particle, one sequence, and another particle, another sequence, another loader for another sequence. Why I use this this way? Because I apply material, I can text to apply material difference on my one loader and on another loader, so you can have a different way for render. It's a different material. The material of Krakatoa, it's different to standard material. You have only the scattering, absorption, emission, and density of your material. But this value, this kind of material, you can find also inside the GUI of Krakatoa in global render value. You can find the override color. This is the color of your sequence, of your particle in this case. And in this case I use also the override emissions. I apply also a different light for have a different effect of illumination. And when I render, I disable render. Okay, when I render, in this case I see it's the voxel effects. It's a very nice effect, very similar to the fog or to the cloud, for example. And here you can see for all lights in your scene is render you have a render pass. You have one render pass for light with the yellow tone. You have the render for blue, for dark blue, and etc. Okay, I render in small version because, and also without motion blur, because it's very slow render. So if you render with voxel, it's not the default kind of render. It's the default, it's particle rendering. But if you render with voxel, you can have these effects. This effect is very nice in some case, and also you can change your voxel size. If you, for example, give more render, you can see different effect. And when you find your sides, your sides in this grid, in this it's similar to grid in your render. When you find your sites, you can render in without problem. So you can see it's have a more blur. It's very similar to the cloud, to the fog. It's not similar to the foam of the water, for example. Okay, if you put, for example, more down, you can render. You can see all little dots of your from RealFlow, for example. This is very slow in this case, but maybe it's okay. Another value, it's very important, is the filter radius. If you change this filter radius, for example, you have another kind of effect. Maybe it's very big radius of your dot. Now you can stop here, for example, and clone your render. If you put, for example, 10 render, okay, you see in this case with big filter you have a more smooth, more on the edge, on the have a more blur on your particle, in your particle effect. And when you find your sites or your it's okay for your look, if you want to give to your render, you can apply your value. Another aspect is the material. The material NA green stain, it's not default. The former default is isotropic. It's the good material work with voxel rendering. And when you render, you can choose also the density of your particle. And for example, if you here I have the alpha channel, you can see it's nice alpha channel. If you want to give more, for example, density from final pass, give 1, for example, and I render. You see here it's very densitive. It's not transparent. It's very densitive material. You can give a low or give more. It's want. This is very, it depends. Another aspect, use emission. If you click on use emission, you can give you can use the color of your emission. You can setting from this value. Another aspect very important when you render with Krakatoa. Krakatoa is rendering of only particles, so you can't render geometry. And for this you can create the set. The set, in this case, the name of the set is the mate with the plane 01. It's the mate object, and for exclude your object for use mate object in Krakatoa, you can go on mate object rollout and apply enable. From default is you find this situation, enable mate object and use this mate object. In this case you can use the mate object and have the mask, and for composite your result in your software similar After Effects, Nuke or Digital Fusion, for example. And another aspect is the motion blur. It's very important. Motion blur from default it's 2 value, but you can give another value, for example 4, but every time you can change this value. Krakatoa rendering for this number x your render. For example, with 4 particle segments, Krakatoa rendering 4 times your render of particle and your frame. So if you put 8, for example, rendering 8 times per frames. What I want to do, what I want to say, it's very clean with another example. With another example, you can open the particle, for example. My particle, I use the material in this case, and in Krakatoa I use also the emission, and also the self shadow with the value for self shadow. It's the same light density, it's the same of concept of the density pass, and here I have 4 for motion blur. Disable the save, and I put yes big but only single. If I render, I can see it's rendered the particle, but 1, 2, 3 and 4 times. If I put 8, for example, I see the render for 1, 2, 3 and 8. And so when render more, you can have the effect of motion blur. If you, for example, put 1, it's very different. In fact, I render, it's not more blur, respect this. Okay, if you put, for example, 12 and render, okay, see, it's not more difference, but it's a very blur on your render. It's but you wait for 12 time of your render, so it's a good value. For example, for this example it's 4, so I use 4 for render all part. In this case, I render the particle with the particle render with the isotropic material, use emission, use the difference density, and the default emission strength, and I use this the color I given the little variation from green. For final pass, I render with another kind. I use the force additive mode without the override color and the override emission. Use the color from the scattering, the emission from material. I give it to one, and to another one it's this, and change the value of density, because if you render now, you see the force additive. What we do, it creates in some part some highlight when the particle is very near, so it's create this effect. It's very nice for render of this case of the waterfall, and also it gave the particle, etc. And okay, when I render with Krakatoa, I go another software for compositing. You can choose from After Effects, from Nuke or Digital Fusion. What you use, it's okay for you. And in After Effects, from I import the file who I save in Xware, but in this case I don't save the file in different paths, because I don't want to show you this in this tutorial. And when you render and you import, you find all your render sequence. More important, in interpreted footage, use the you can choose your kind of the interpretation of alpha channel, but very important is enable to RGB. If you don't have the from project setting, if you don't have the channel profound and sRGB profile in your workspace. Okay, when and I pat my particle, the down layer is the normal mode, and I apply the force in add with the opacity. I change the opacity, and my water voxel mode render, and I have my waterfall. After you can rendering and you have the final result. Typical workflow in RealFlow, it's create the emitters, create the simulation of emitter, and after apply the mesh. When you apply the mesh, you can apply different kind of mesh. You find after you find the particle mesh with render kit, particle mesh is standard, and grid mesh. Grid mesh usually you can use with Hybrido, and for large scale of simulation. And the standard is the standard particle mesh with some setting. It's very nice, but for example, you can create mesh, the kind of mesh, and the texture. If you apply the texture from particle, the filters it's very nice because it's regular the tensions and the relax on your mesh, and the step, how much step used, but very, and you can optimize, etc. But I think it's nice use the render kit mesh because you have more control with also the particle magnitudes with velocity, force, age, and etc. It's very nice for render, for create the mesh. When you create the mesh, you can also create particle mesh. Press the right button from mouse, insert emitters, and you can choose the emitters who can create the mesh. You can select all or only what your choose. For example, cylinder in this case. Okay, cylinder, this is without the mesh. For example, now I can hide some elements. Hide one. Okay, and okay, it's the cylinder is native, but when you create the mesh, you can click on the cache mode. In this way, you can calculate the simulation and recalculate the simulation when create the mesh. It's very nice in this case. Okay, and it's very easy simulation in this case with the cylinders, emitters, and the particle go down and stop a collision with the plane. Okay, now you can create the mesh. For create the mesh, you can choose if build mesh, yes, in this case, because you want the mesh. The kind of mesh is a sphere. You can create a sphere or metables kind. I prefer metables kinds, and out polygons. Out polygon sites. RealFlow create the good value from he think it's for this mesh, but you can say no. You have the polygon sites. What the change? If you click build mesh, you see in this case, if you press 0 from the number, you can see the smooth version. With 9 only the mesh, but you can see 8 0. You can see it's very big, it's very big mesh is very near to the blob, for example, you can give a more low 0.2, build the mesh. It's create the mesh now. It's very, when you create the mesh, the grid of your mesh, it's increase more, and for this is increase more also the time for creation the mesh, and for this maybe it's very okay. See, it's very big grids on your triangulars, and for this it's very high, but I can give 0.4 for example, build. Okay, it's again the mesh it's near the blob, so you can give more smooth, for example 100, 200. This value you can find more description of all value in the manual of RealFlow. Is the free PDF you can find online. It's very nice and it's very good for understand your RealFlow. But now it's again more high, and so I can work with the filter. Apply the filter, relax 0.08 for example, and steps I can give okay. Another aspect very important, you can also create the extension inside. If you click on the cylinder, you find the field and the particle filter. The field is you can create another details inside your particle mesh, and for example, if I can display, yes, in this case I have the out polygon, and you can see it's the out polygon detect what you do, because in this case I don't want it's not necessary create the particle mesh, and you see it's very is straight from the mesh. This is because I work on the filter, I give the relax, and after I work on the sides of my filter, and in this case you can work well done for creating your mirror mesh. When you finish, if you open the project folder, you find inside the mesh your bin mesh with the name particle mesh render kit 01. It's this render kit 01, and you can load inside 3ds Max or Maya or Softimage your mesh and render with mesh with apply material. Another aspect very important is this mesh. When you finish to build your mesh, for build the sequence, you can go to command, system command, mesh, build the mesh. When you finish, you can see this mesh, it's in real time from RealFlow. It's very nice. More aspect, more value you can find in the particle mesh. You can find also in the particle mesh standard, and maybe for start it's very nice, because in the filter you find more deformation, more fractal noise, for example, the speed stretching, the minimum maximum, and the blend factor. It's very you can understand if you are at the beginning. You can understand, you can start to understand the function of your the mesh from here.